So this is what happened over the subsequent years. If you look at comparison from June 2001 to June 2010, all right, the number of Singaporeans in the workforce, okay, this is the total labor force, increased by 16.6%. That's the light blue bar right at the bottom, 16.6%. The number of permanent residents increased 91%. That means foreigners, immigrants becoming permanent residents in Singapore increased 91%. And the number of foreign workers, the number of foreign laborers in Singapore increased by 58.6%. So if you look at the overall number, Singaporeans still contribute, are still more than half of the total workforce, but the foreigners and the PRs are quickly catching up, right, and making up almost half of it now. So they contributed, more than disproportionately to the 34.6% overall growth in the labor force. What has this resulted in? Well, it's created a lot of growth, as I talked about. Growth in the numbers, growth in jobs, growth in the economy in general. So you see that the Singapore today was very, very different from Singapore 10 years ago. We have a lot more vibrant, a lot more dynamic and vibrant city, and also a lot more expats among us and foreign workers, right? Foreign faces. At the same time, it also created, it pushed up wages at the top. So those, the wealthy in the top 10, 20% of our income distribution were earning more. But those at the bottom weren't feeling the benefits of this growth. So their income, their salaries that they took home was increasing at a much lower rate. I think for some years, the real income growth for those at the top, the bottom 20% was actually negative. That means if you include inflation, the effects of rising consumer prices around us, the cost of buying a car, the cost of food, restaurants, and general services like healthcare, basically their income growth wasn't keeping pace with that, right? So their wealth, their purchasing power, if you guys learn about that in economics as well, was declining. So what it's resulted in is that income inequality in Singapore has surged over the past 10 years specifically. And the final impact it had on our businesses and our economy was that this thing called productivity, which is the efficiency of your labor and capital inputs, right? When you take away your technology, the capital that you put into the economy and the labor, the amount of people working and man hours. When you take all that away, the productivity itself, the efficiency, was growing at a very, very slow pace. For the past 12 years, I think, we average 1.7%. Okay? This is at the bottom half of what developed countries generally produce for productivity. Right? It's about 1 to 3%. So it was slowing down. And why was this? Because companies could simply hire cheap, low, relatively... is that my time? No. I'm almost done, don't worry. So basically the productivity was declining because foreign workers were so cheap to employ and so easy to obtain that a lot of businesses were simply hiring them, so they didn't have to pay higher salaries, they didn't have to invest in technology to make their processes more efficient, right? So maybe you see, in a restaurant like Fish & Co, for example, maybe there were at some point a lot of waiters, right? And that is changing now. So this has really changed the conversation. If you look at, it's created huge tensions in society, this influx of immigrants and foreign workers. Not just on the economic side, not only has inequality grown to quite a worrying stage, but we are seeing a capacity shortage in our MRTs and buses, right? So if you take the bus and MRT during rush hour, it's very crammed, it's very jammed. And, growing enclaves of foreign workers are growing in the HDB flats in some cases. And there are also social tensions. If you remember, there was a Chinese blogger who, criticized Singaporeans. And more recently, there was a Chinese resident who was driving a Ferrari, and he crashed and killed 2 people in a taxi, right? So these were all sort of a symptom. I wouldn't say a symptom, but things that had occurred at the same time that Singapore is letting in a lot of new immigrants, new citizens into our society, and also having a lot of foreign workers come in. And this was creating a lot of unhappiness among the Singaporeans. They felt that the home that they belonged to didn't feel like home anymore, right? I don't know if you guys share that sentiment. I guess in schools as well, the problem is you worry about whether new citizens or foreigners are taking up your places in universities. From primary 1, there's already competition for places, and your parents are also worried. So this is basically affecting emotions across the whole spectrum. So the conversation changed. Most notably, last year in the general elections, there was a lot of unhappiness that was shown, and it showed in the election results. So the government has changed its position somewhat. This is what PM said in 2009. We cannot do without them, but we need to find ways to reduce our dependence on them. And then in his budget speech, Finance Minister, Deputy Prime Minister Tharman, that's what he said. Calibrated steps to manage the dependence on foreign workers. Right? It's a very significant change, in my opinion, from what we were hearing our government leaders say in 1997, the year 2000, and even in 2003. There are social and physical limits, right? But I think at this point, there are a lot of concerns about in this foreign worker debate. But I wanted to also point out that it's not a conversation that Singapore is having alone or that is unique to Singapore. It is a conversation that a lot of other developed countries which have opened their doors to immigrants and foreign workers are facing, right? So in the UK, income inequality is rising. The economy is, in quite a terrible shape, and it's affecting politics as well. So here's what Ed Miliband, who's the leader of the opposition Labour Party right now, had to say recently. And I think, it's quite provocative, right? We were too dazzled by globalization, he said, and too sanguine about its price. By focusing too much on globalization and migration's impact on growth, we lost sight of who was benefiting from that growth and the people who were being squeezed. I think it really sort of sums up what has happened in Singapore over the past 10 years. So what is being done now? It's a very serious conversation that's being had at all levels. The government has tightened quite significantly on its on the foreign worker inflow. It's introduced higher levies, which are going to be phased in up till 2013. A levy is basically the amount of money a company has to pay for a work permit on top of the, in order to get a work permit for to hire a foreign worker. It's also lowered the dependency ratio ceilings, which is the ratio of locals to foreigners that you can have in a particular industry, right? So particularly in manufacturing, construction, services, these have been lowered. That means for every Singaporean now, you can only have fewer, you can hire fewer foreign workers. It's also encouraged productivity growth, right, by giving out productivity innovation credits, which is some tax relief on companies that invest money into investing in technology that will speed up processes, right? So for example, I think in some restaurants now we've seen people using iPads to hire, to order food. So instead of having, one waiter for every table, you can have maybe one waiter that serves 5 or 6 tables, and then you have an iPad on each table that can speed up things, right? So that's productivity enhancements. So in construction, for example, instead of having 100 or how many, foreign workers working at a construction site, you can have fewer if you invest in technology to make some processes easier when you're building, a certain site. But is this enough? The government is also trying to raise wages at the bottom because it's depressed the wages for the very poor, right? So a cleaner makes, for example, $800 a month, okay? Most of you will never, fortunately, see that kind of salary. But there are people in our economy who are getting that, and it's insufficient for them to survive on. So what is the government doing about that? It's trying to introduce measures to raise these wages at the bottom. But my question is it enough? And what are the costs of reducing these foreign workers and immigrants into our society? PM has made this quite poignant. He said there are going to be trade-offs. There is a high price to pay by having fewer foreign workers. And a lot of economists have actually disagreed, right? They think that it's not necessarily the truth. If our productivity can rise to 2 to 3 or even higher than that, because of the efficiency, we don't need so many labor inputs, we don't need so many workers, and therefore, it won't necessarily result in companies shutting down or companies, not having enough workers for their business. Of course, companies have another view. They think that they're never going to be able to do without foreigners, and they think there's going to be huge consolidation, especially in the SME sector. So a lot of companies are going to shut down because they can no longer survive. They can't find foreign workers. Singaporeans don't want to do the jobs of cleaners and waitresses and waiters and things like that. So we don't really know, right? We can only hope that by having enough productivity, this will be the cure-all. And my theory is that, this is a simplistic way of looking at the whole conversation. It's not just a matter of reducing foreign workers and increasing productivity, right? My bigger concerns are that it's going to affect the quality of our growth, and that is also something that is uncertain now, right? How is our economy going to grow in the future as we reduce our dependence on foreign workers? What are the kinds of jobs and skills that we need to face these to take up these jobs in the future as the foreign worker dependence decreases? From my conversations with people who are in the SME business sector, or conversations I've heard, there is a worry that SMEs, bosses, think that the government will eventually reopen this tap and just let in foreign workers back into the country at a higher rate because it's the easy thing to do, and with enough pressure on them, they'll eventually do it. So some people may actually hope that there's a slowdown in the Singapore economy, a recession, right? Because when there's a recession, the government tends to be quite generous in its benefits. So, might it reverse course on this policy? So far, the government has said no, and it wants to stick quite stridently, I think, to this view. Because it recognizes that if we don't increase productivity, if we don't have enough incentives for companies to invest in productivity, this will never happen, right? There'll be a moral hazard situation. People always think, well, I can always just wait for the government to reopen the tap, and that'll be a cure-all. So I think that is quite an important conversation and a question that needs to be answered in the next few years. Another one is, how will it change our social compact? What will our society look like, when we have rising wages, fewer foreigners, population growth that's slowing? What does it do to the kind of society that we live in, right? And the bigger conversation is that as our population ages, and if we take in fewer new citizens, there's going to be a higher and higher dependency ratio. That means a greater burden on the young people. That means you guys, when you enter the workforce 10 years from now, supporting your parents who will eventually retire and be unemployed. So what is this going to do, right? We're going to have to increase the social spending to help those who can't afford healthcare, who don't have an income. Hello. Right. Okay, I guess I really need to wrap up, right? They're turning off the power as well. So yeah, I mean, that's an important conversation we're having, and that's why a lot of people are interested in something called the Nordic model, right? How the Danish and the Norwegians and the Swedes live, because they don't have a very large immigrant population. Theirs is quite homogeneous, and everyone kind of has the same ethnic roots, right? But their social spending is very high. That means the amount of money that the government spends and invests in social issues, social concerns like education and healthcare is very, very high. Public spending as a total percentage of GDP is 40 to 50% in some countries. In Singapore, it's 17%, 17 versus 50. Okay, but their taxes in the Nordic countries are also at those rates, 40 to 50%. That means if you're earning in the top income bracket or middle income bracket, which a lot of you will be, half your salary will go to the government, right? Half your salary. Right now, most people don't pay taxes because the tax rate is progressive and quite low, right? So even the wealthiest people only pay 20% of their income. So what will this change in our social compact and how, our society is? And the final question is, how will it change our lifestyle? I was having this conversation recently, and I think not enough people are thinking about what exactly it means if our wages of cleaners and waiters and garbage collectors increase substantially, right? So if you're not paying $800, but you're paying, let's say, $1,000 or $2,000 a month to this a cleaner, that job becomes a lot more attractive to you, right? And let's say in Denmark, I think, or in Norway, I looked. The salary of a teacher and the salary of a garbage collector are actually quite similar. So what would you choose to do, right? Be a teacher or a garbage collector? Because as a garbage collector, you only work a few hours a day, a relatively stress-free job, right? You don't have to mark papers, you don't have to deal with talkative JC students, right? You don't have to do all your ECAs and all that, right? So this will change lifestyles and the choices you make in society. So it's quite fascinating, and I think Singapore is starting to move in that direction. I don't know how far it will move, but these are all things I hope you will think about, and I hope will provoke you to think about. It's not just about having foreign workers or not having foreign workers. The conversation, the debate is much more nuanced, much more complex than that. The government has a very, very big challenge on it to get the balance right. And it will have economic, social, and political impact on you as well, right? Economic because of the wages that you earn, social because of the people that you'll be living around and the kind of jobs you have, and political because if you're not happy, then you can vote and decide what you want at the polls.